Jesus, one of the main things the longer I read about Jesus, one of the things I notice about him that is sort of different than most great people is how much time and energy he focused on things that other folks saw as small or insignificant. He told stories about sparrows, about lilies of the field. He told stories about giving a cup of cold water, the simplest act. He told stories about a woman who gave less than half a cent. He told stories about little children. Now, that's commonplace in our day, but in his day, to tell stories about children other than being an appendage was something out of the ordinary. And it's so different than what our culture celebrates because we're all into bigness, spectacles, numbers. Across my desk, I will get letters from visiting ministers who want to show up. They'll promise X number of decisions. I don't know how they can do that, but they do. It's all about being bigger, better, faster, stronger, more spectacular. And it seems contrary to what Jesus talks about so often, never more dramatically than in Luke chapter 13. If you look on the screen, Luke 13, and we're just going to look at 2 verses. Then Jesus asked, "What is the kingdom of God like?" This is a question that they talked about quite a bit. What is the kingdom of God like? What shall I compare it to? Now, you're waiting on something big and spectacular and dramatic. And here's the answer. It is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his garden. It grew and became a tree, and the birds perched in its branches. Now, that's just pretty simple, isn't it? A mustard seed so small that it took quite a few just to weigh an ounce. Mustard seeds were not highly thought about in his culture. Anybody ever lived where you have kudzu? You know what kudzu is like? If you can imagine kudzu, you can think about mustard trees. They were not highly valued like you might value a dogwood or an oak. Just plain old things. And they start out little, but they have something about them that they explode in growth. From these tiny little seeds, they can grow 8, 10, 12 feet tall. And there's something about them that Jesus says, this is what my kingdom is like. It starts small, it starts insignificant, and it starts in places you wouldn't imagine. Imagine today that we announced that we're going to build a mall in Hancock County. Now, if you're from Hancock County, don't take offense. But can you imagine what would happen if somebody said that Belk and Penny's and Sears are all going to Hancock County and going to build a big mall right there in town? What would you think about that? Right in downtown Sneedville. What would you? Or you're going to start a mega church over in Pennington Gap. What would you think about that? You might think it seems a little outrageous, and that's exactly what Jesus is trying to say about his kingdom. He starts in a backwater place called Galilee. Now, none of us is from Galilee. Some of us have been there. It's absolutely beautiful, but it's a backwater place. It's just like you cannot imagine starting any ministry in Galilee. It's just where people who are nobodies live. But that's where Jesus starts. Not only does he start in Galilee, he starts with a group of people that the book of Acts tells us are plain and uneducated, just run-of-the-mill people. And then he throws in a tax collector. He throws in a zealot, a person that was trying to overthrow the government. And he says, this is going to be my kingdom. But there's something more than just the little business I want you to see. Look at that last little phrase. It grew and became a tree, and the birds perched in its branches. Now, doesn't that sound nice? Isn't it nice? You have any birds that wake you up in the morning outside in your trees? Some of you have that, and sometimes you want to go shoot the bird because it's too early. But anyway, you get this tree out there, and what that's telling us, if you study this text closely, It's echoing back to the prophecy of a man named Ezekiel. Anybody ever read Ezekiel's prophecy? It's pretty colorful. It goes all the way back to the prophecy of a man named Ezekiel. And in chapter 17, Ezekiel's talking about a tree that's going to grow, and it's going to welcome, it says this, it's going to welcome all the birds of the air. Now, I want you to look outside your house tomorrow, if you have any trees where birds show up, and see if there's a sign that says, no red birds allowed. Okay? See if you've got a tree that, do you remember Charlie Brown? Anybody remember Charlie Brown? What kind of a tree did Charlie Brown know? Anybody remember? It was a kite-eating tree. Remember that? He knew kite-eating trees. Well, these trees that Jesus is talking about welcome every kind of bird. I've never seen a tree that had a do not trespass sign on it for birds. Have you? But Jesus' contemporaries knew what it was to exclude people. They excluded people by race, by nationality, by gender. They excluded people by profession. If you were a shepherd, you weren't welcome. And Jesus says the kingdom of God is going to be this little bitty seed, and it's going to explode, and it's going to grow way beyond anything we can ever imagine. And guess what? It's going to welcome every kind of bird to the tree. And they're saying, well, that's a little different than what we understand. What's it mean for us? What's this text mean for us? I've heard about mustard seeds all my life. You probably heard about them in Bible school, Sunday school when you were kids. What does this story mean? What does it say the kingdom of God is like this? What application does it have for us? I think here's what it means for us. It means that our normal, everyday ministry as individuals, as a church, doesn't have to be spectacular to be important. That you may be feeling like, I can never do anything great for God, and you're not looking through God's eyes. I want to tell you a few stories this morning of people who started small. People who started small and their ministry exploded beyond anything they could ever have imagined. And in every one of these stories I'm going to tell you, not only did a mustard seed explode, but it also welcomed every kind of bird of the air. I want to start with a woman who lived in the 19th century. She was 4 feet 9 inches tall. A lot of you already know because you grew up hearing about Saint Lottie. We don't have saints in the Baptist church, but if we did, she'd be at the top of the pole. Lottie Charlotte Diggs Moon from Virginia, not far from here. A woman went all the way to China in the 1880s. Not to the big cities, but to the back country. And while she was there, that tiny mustard seed of faith exploded to the point that people were becoming Christians, listening to this 4 foot 9 inch tall female from Virginia teaching, lo and behold, men and women. And the ministry grew beyond her wildest dreams. You know, if you know her story, that she loved the ministry so much that she eventually starved to death because she was giving her food to those folks. But her name for almost 150 years is said with hushed tones in Baptist life because she's the example. But she started out small. December 1955, another woman living in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress, a mustard seed person. A long day of work. She got on the bus, and she was pretty exhausted. She sat down at the front of the bus. She didn't go to the back. She sat down at the front of the bus. The bus driver said, "I'm sorry, back of the bus." She said, "I'm not going to do that today. Not going to do that today." Did you know that Rosa Parks in 1999 received the Congressional Medal of Honor? And she was the first woman ever to lie in state in the United States Capitol. Did you know that? Just a mustard seed, just a plain, ordinary human being who was tired of being a part of a tree that didn't welcome everybody. It was 1942, 13 years before her, that a fellow finished his PhD at my school in Louisville. Finished his PhD in New Testament. And he went to Americus, Georgia, of all places. Americus, Georgia. And he had farming in his background. And he started a farm in Americus, Georgia. In 1942, there were lots of farms in Americus, Georgia, but there weren't many that had blacks and whites working as equals. But Clarence Jordan said, "That's how we're going to do things here." Now, it was not met with wonderful applause by everybody. But Clarence Jordan says, "Here's how we're going to do things." And he started what he called Koinonia Farms. Maybe you know that's a Christian word, that word koinonia. And Clarence Jordan says, here we're going to do things differently. And in encountering those folks who were different, he learned that they probably didn't read the Bible. Some of them couldn't read at all. And so he wrote a New Testament. He wrote the Gospels. He used his PhD in New Testament Greek to translate the Gospels into something you ought to read if you ever have a chance. It's called the Cotton Patch Gospel. If you've never read it, it's worth reading. It's the Gospel of Jesus in the language of rural South Georgia minorities. It's been made into a musical. I hope you've seen it. Well, Clarence Jordan had his ups and downs. He was finally buried in a pine box down in Americus, unbecoming a PhD in New Testament, but becoming a man who loved Jesus. And the funniest thing happened. In 1965, a multimillionaire went down to Americus. He had heard about Koinonia Farms. A multimillionaire went down to Americus, and he saw what was happening at Koinonia, and he began to understand that what he had done so successfully in life needed to be applied to his faith life. He was a builder, successful builder, and he began to understand by seeing these folks in need down in Americus that he could use his gifts to help other people. And so he left his millionaire lifestyle behind, and he started an institution that a lot of you have worked with, Habitat for Humanity. And Millard Fuller had that mustard seed of faith explode down in Americus. Welcomed all people. And for years, one of the greatest witnesses to interracial cooperation in this city has been our church and African American churches working hand in hand, side by side, to build houses irregardless of what your race is. And another fellow went down there who had this bizarre dream of becoming president of the United States. And in his 90s, he still works on Habitat houses. Isn't that incredible how that little seed in Americus, Georgia, a little country farm down in South Georgia, could build houses around the world regardless of race or any other disqualifier. And you're saying, but I can't do that. I can't build houses. I don't have a PhD. I don't have the strength to sit at the front of the bus when I'm supposed to go to the back of the bus. I'm not going to China, so what in the world can I do? One of my teachers told me a story a long time ago, and I've never forgotten it. He told me a story of a little boy, and this boy had heard about missionaries in India, of all places. And the little boy wanted to have his part in helping the missionaries. So he only had a nickel. And he took his nickel to his pastor, and he said, would you send this to the missionaries in India? Now, you know, it costs more postage to send in than it does the gift. That's okay. And the pastor said, I'll be glad to. So he sent the nickel to the missionary in India, who was able to use the nickel to buy a little New Testament in the language of the people of that area. And he put it on his shelf. And he thought, I'll deal with this. And a few days later, a man walked in, had walked 20 miles because he had heard there was a place with Bibles. And he had heard about Jesus. The missionary gave him the Bible with the little boy's name in it. And that's the end of the story. Except that 20 years later, that same missionary went out to this remote area, 25 miles away. He had never actually encountered anybody there. He went out there and he was shocked because he expected to find people who'd never heard the gospel before. And when he got there, he began telling the story of the gospel. And they said, we know this. We know all about Jesus. We worship him. We're believers. And he said, how? I've never been here. And the old man that he'd forgotten about said, here. And he handed him a New Testament with a boy's name in it. He said, we've been reading this for 20 years. It was just a boy. It was just a nickel. It was just a mustard seed. It was just a farm. But you see, that's what happens. That's what happens when you entrust your mustard seed to the God who says, follow me. I don't know where you are in your faith pilgrimage today. Maybe you think you have nothing to offer. Maybe you think you're not gifted enough or talented enough, or maybe you're too young or too old or whatever. The people whose stories I told you vary widely in age and gender, education. But every one of them somehow took that little seed and said to God, this is yours. Do with it what you will. And lives were changed. And that can be your story too. Let's pray.